we have any questions? Bob, yes.
Yes, Doctor. You mentioned three specifics in binding
Yes.
that the rabbis are responsible for. What about loosing? What specifically would be involved there?
That's a very good question. Loosing is especially talked about in the context of the sacrament of reconciliation, right? Jesus says this, uses the same passage, the same idea of binding and loosing when he uses it in the context of forgiveness of sins, which he gives to not just Peter, but to all of the apostles. Right, the distinction is that Peter is given this overall authority because he has the keys. He is the prime minister, the prime steward. But he has other stewards under, we would say, in collaboration with him. But he has the final say with these. So in terms of loosing, this would be especially carried out in the forgiveness of sins. There are a couple of other things that we can talk about, but we should think primarily about the forgiveness of sins in loosing. Good question. Yes?
Should we be in closer communication with other Catholics? I'm thinking of, for example, in my experience, Jews seem to be very socially connected, even the ones that aren't believers in God. I mean, they still go to temple, they're connected. It seems to me that we meet other Catholics, we happen to find out on the airplane, they're Catholic, and I don't know, for myself, I never think anything about it. Should we say something like, we're in communion with Christ?
Well, that is a reality, right? Because of this radical communion, because we are one body, we are in a greater relationship, we have a greater communion than we do with those who we are maybe biologically related to that are not in communion with Jesus Christ, right? And so we have this obligation to them as well because of this communion. Now, with regard to family members, we have because of this this natural, rather than supernatural, this natural communion, we do have a greater obligation toward them. But our relationship, our obligation to Christians, Catholics who are the fullness of the church, right, and other Christians, is greater than to non-Christians, right, because of this proximity. So exactly how we should carry this out, prudence, I suppose, would carry the day. Because if you're talking to another Catholic who doesn't have any clue of this, you would have to go through a long catechesis to help them to understand it, I suppose. But listening and understanding where they are and mentioning this within with regard to their understanding and living out the faith, mentioning this in that context, I think, could be helpful, could be appropriate, depending on the context. But it is a truth. It's a truth. It's an ontological, if you will. It's a fact of being, of our very nature, our very transformed nature, our supernaturalized nature, that we have this radical communion with every other baptized Christian.
Every other baptized Christian, not only Catholics.
Right. Everyone who's baptized is in the church. The more full we have, right, we could perhaps look at it in terms of, it's sometimes shown as this, right? If this is the church, right, let's call that this line right here, everyone who is in communion with Christ. And within that, we would have the Catholic Church. Everybody who's baptized into the Catholic Church, confirmed, if you will. Visibly, right, the more that we possess, the more that we adhere to, the closer to the center, the fullness that we have, the fullness of the means of grace. Right? Jews, we would probably put just on this outside line, right? Because they're not baptized, but they have the covenant, right? So they do not have there's one covenant, right? This covenant, but they're living, right there. We can perhaps think about this in terms of, I don't know, someone who's married, right? And say that one of them, the bride gets amnesia and doesn't realize that she's not, that the marriage has been consummated. Right? Jews, they still, still thinks that we're in this betrothal. There's this promise. Right? Jews are living in according to a covenant that really can't be lived in according to that. Because there's only one covenant. But they still, because through no fault of their own, are living in this same covenant. So there's a radical communion that we have with them. So much so that Pope Pius XII called them our elder brothers and sisters in the faith. Right? So you would Greek Orthodox, or the Orthodox, right, are just outside of this full visible communion. And to the degree that you have, Lutherans might be here because they have a liturgy, even if they don't have valid holy orders. But the, fundamentalists, right, Bible Christians who have very little but just their interpretation of the Bible, would have the least of the means of grace, but they still would be within this communion. Everyone who's baptized. Now, we'll talk more about baptism, a little bit more about, not a lot, it's in the next session. But those who are in union with Christ, whether it's a sacramental baptism or a baptism of desire, which we'll talk about later, they still are members of the body. Any other questions?
The church is the bride of Christ. What are we as individuals in that relationship? Are we brides, or?
That's a good question. Yeah, in a certain sense, this can get into a long discussion, I suppose. But those who can be symbols of the church, right? The Blessed Virgin is really the personification of the church. Right? She is the one who has already reached the point that the church is. She is the mother of all Christians, as we read in Revelation chapter 12. Right? She is really the personification of the church. This is why the church calls her the mediatrix of all graces, because the church mediates the grace of Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit to its individual members. So, as a model, an image of the church, only a woman can be that image of the bride, but we share in it. And so many of the mystics, right, we can go back to Pope Gregory the Great, and we can talk, and his name won't come to me right now. The great Marian mystic, St. John of the Cross. Those mystics, if you will, in mysticism, when we talk about mystics, we think about those who are most in union with Christ. Right? Talk about the soul as a spouse. In fact, St. John of the Cross explicitly says, before God, all souls are feminine. Right? We have to understand, really, and we can understand this in a particular perspective. Masculinity and femininity are in the human domain, the human realm, right? Human masculinity has no meaning except in the face of complementary femininity and vice versa. So it's relational. Femininity and masculinity are a way of relating. So our way of relating to God is God, and this is really what human masculinity represents, right, is this love of initiation. As St. John says, that it is not that we have loved God, it's that God has first loved us. Right? And our then active response, which is what femininity, human femininity, represents, right? This active acceptance and response of that initiative of love. So it's a relational quality. It's not really what we are, it's the way, it's how we are, who we are.